Congressman Louie Gohmert, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Why are you running for Texas Attorney General, and what are your priorities?
Well, first of all, I never thought about running for Attorney General of Texas until 2021. I'd become concerned about the lack of efforts by our Attorney General to investigate clear reports of election fraud in the 2018 election. And I thought the guy I voted for, Mr. Paxton, would be a national hero if he dug in and investigated what appeared to be significant fraud in Dallas County. But it never happened. And so I became increasingly concerned. And as more reports spread about problems, and I knew I'd seen clear evidence, then I didn't understand why it wasn't pursued. I still don't. And then with the governor's mandate in April of 2020 over COVID, parts seemed good, but some seemed to exceed his constitutional authority. And I would have thought the Attorney General, I mean, I've known Governor Abbott since he and I got elected to be district judges in 1992. The thing that should have happened is the AG going and saying, Governor, you're exceeding your authority. Here's what you can do to stay within your constitutional limits, and that way I don't have to go to court and force the issue. There continue to be some mandates from some sources, including the president, that I believe are unconstitutional. Our AG has gotten more active since he realized he's got to run and he's going to have opponents, but it's not enough. Further, I think the AG should have done a lot more to help make sure our border is secure. For example, I understand the Supreme Court case involving Arizona, where they said state and local law enforcement cannot be involved in enforcing immigration laws. However, Article 4 of the U.S. Constitution is a guarantee from the federal government to the states that they will have a Republican form of government, little r, and also they'll be free from invasion. Well, we need a determination what an invasion is, but I would submit before you get to 2 million people coming into the country illegally, you have an invasion.
So you're saying that the term invasion in the Constitution could be also just for migrants coming across the border, as opposed to an army of a government?
Well, I'm saying when you have drug cartels from Mexico that are controlling the U.S. border, and they're determining who comes in illegally, you've got an invasion problem. When you're sending in massive amounts of illegal drugs, you're sending in drug trafficking, you're sending in sex trafficking, human trafficking, and that's controlled by organized crime, and the federal government is doing nothing but encouraging people to come in illegally, then yeah, that's an invasion at that point, and we should be able to protect our own border.
So listening to what you're saying is the reasons that you got into this race are because you believe that the incumbent, Ken Paxton, hasn't done a good enough job protecting the state?
Exactly, and I think another thing that really pushed the issue was looking into the things that the 7 top people in his AG's office, attorneys we're talking about, people of integrity, Republicans, ended up turning him in to the FBI, and knowing how political the federal DOJ has gotten, many of us fully expect he will be indicted after the primary, when, according to the legislative attorneys that do research, Texas law is clear, you cannot replace his name on the ballot if he's indicted after winning the primary.
So what's your biggest fear?
that he would win the primary and then be indicted. He lost so much in the way of support between 2014 and 2018, dropping about 8 points. Originally, I was thinking he probably won with about the same margin that Abbott and Patrick did, but he fell from between 58 and 59 points in 2014 to just over 50.56 in 2018. So when people start finding out, not just whether or not he's indicted, but how tawdry his actions actually have been, the distractions he's created for himself in his last term, I think he'll fall way below 50%. He would lose the office, and then the highest law enforcement officer in the state could end up being somebody that Soros or others have put in office in order not to enforce the law. And we just can't have that in Texas.
I was just going to ask you, I mean, you could have remained a congressman in East Texas until you decide to retire. Obviously, you're choosing to run for this office. Why do you believe you are the best Republican for the job?
And thank you for asking. That's a great question. I would not have run unless I felt like that was the case. And it's because I look back on my adult history. Unlike Paxton, I was never in-house counsel for most of my career as he was. I've been a litigator. I've been an assistant DA, trying cases there. I've tried cases in all kinds of courts. Civil litigator, because that's part of the role of the Attorney General. I've had appeals. And then I was a trial judge, handling felonies and major civil litigation for a decade. Governor Perry appointed me to finish a term as Chief Justice of a Court of Appeals. And then the last 17 years in Congress, I've been on the Judiciary Committee, where we battle over words and phrases and what they would mean to law. So I think far and away, there's nobody as qualified, including the current AG, as I am to be Attorney General. I've shown that I am a man of principle, including going after my own party leaders when they're wrong, which unfortunately has been numerous times. And so I felt like I needed to run for Attorney General. And as you say, most people would say, well, you've been winning with 3/4 of the vote in East Texas. Why would you leave a sure bet? Well, it's to save Texas, because if we don't save Texas and get it back more into the law-abiding and law-enforcing category, then we're going to lose the country. I'm running to save Texas so we can save the country.
How are you going to convince Republican primary voters that you're the right person for the job when former President Trump has endorsed Paxton and actually just held a fundraiser for him last month at Mar-a-Lago?
Well, I talked to the president when I heard last summer that he was thinking about endorsing Paxton, and he told me Paxton was calling him 3 or 4 times every week for many weeks, begging for the endorsement. And I suggested that he hold up. I said, I'm even thinking about it if there's not a better alternative. And so when I heard a few weeks later he endorsed Paxton, I didn't contact him again. But after I announced I was going to see if I could raise money to get in even as late as November, he called me and he said, I was told that you were definitely not running before I endorsed. And well, I didn't tell him that. And so with Paxton, it became clear it took a lie to President Trump that Gohmert's definitely not running in order to get the endorsement. And it further reinforces this AG will do anything, say anything to get what he wants, and that's not the kind of attorney general we need. But when President Trump called me, he said, well, I sure don't want to hurt you. You know, you've been so helpful and all. But yeah.
Who made the lie?
Well, you can speculate on that, but it wasn't me. And we know that he was calling him, according to the president, 3 and 4 times a week. So you can speculate, but I think your guesses would be good. There's only one person that helped to lie and say I was definitely not running, and that was Ken Paxton. So either him, somebody on his behalf, nobody else had any motive to say that and lie about it, because I continued to wrestle with it, and it became clear by November there was a good chance there wouldn't even be a runoff. And so it looked like, sounded like even then, and sounded more every day like there will be a runoff, and it'll be him and me.
What are your priorities?
Well, number one, make sure we have free and fair elections. Every legal vote counts. I want to end any unconstitutional mandates. I want to secure the border, and I also want to protect parents. When you have a runaway DOJ that thinks that the biggest terrorist threat are parents that are concerned about their children's education and show up at school board meetings, then that DOJ needs to be reined in, and I think I'd be the person to do that.
You talked about a lot of issues, and I want to get to those. I did want to ask you about one issue that has been in the headlines, obviously, for months now, and that's the Texas Heartbeat Act.
Yeah.
Where are you specifically on the civil enforcement, the fact that civil lawsuits are the way to enforce that? Is this something that you think, do you agree with? And do you think that while the U.S. Supreme Court has not really, they've let the law continue, but do you think that ultimately this is going to come down to the Texas Supreme Court deciding whether this is law, is constitutional in the Texas Constitution?
Yeah, well, I think for Texas, it will likely come down to the Texas Supreme Court making that decision. And with regard to the U.S. Supreme Court, by your question, you're aware of the way they looked at this, and even both conservatives and more liberal justices on the U.S. Supreme Court had concern about exactly what you're asking, the enforcement mechanism, having civil lawsuits be the enforcement. And I do have some concerns about that. It seems like a fantastic idea to enforce, and the libertarian side of me says, you know, let them, we don't need excessive laws. We could let litigation take care of things. But in this case, an example that I think the Supreme Court justices were concerned about, well, what if you decided to enforce gun control laws by civil lawsuits? You could actually bankrupt everybody that had a gun or manufactured a gun. So just by allowing the sheer volume of lawsuits against somebody. So I do have concerns about the propriety of enforcing things that way. My preference when it comes to something like that is to let the AG or DAs or both be an enforcement mechanism for something that is constitutional, ensuring things that are constitutional are carried out, things that are not constitutional are not. That would be my preference. I do have concerns about, when I first heard about it, I thought it was brilliant, but the more I thought about it, I have concerns. You could just bankrupt anybody with whom you disagree if that's the mechanism, allowing piling on civil lawsuits.
I wanted to ask you about, we talked about, you discussed mandates. Where are you on the vaccine and mask mandates? and then the discussion by many Republicans about banning mandates for vaccines and masks.
Well, I think the kind of mandates we've gotten on vaccines are unconstitutional. They should be unconstitutional. We're 2 years in, and this Omicron virus, for some of us, it's basically an answered prayer. Doctors had talked about, if we're fortunate, if we're really blessed, then maybe it will devolve into a virus that doesn't kill anybody. And so far, it hasn't. Yet, it's contagious, so people will end up with the antibodies to help fight off future viruses like that. According to the Israeli study, probably the best that's been done, people that have the antibodies that have had COVID, they are in better shape for fighting off COVID than anybody with the vaccine. And of course, we know Fauci was totally wrong when he said the vaccine would take care of things. Then we got down to maybe 60% effective, and then we've seen the last numbers in the UK that 81% of the people in the last 3 months who had died of COVID were fully vaccinated. So there are concerns, and I filed a bill, obviously with Pelosi in charge. She's not going to bring it to the floor, but to lay the groundwork, so hopefully one of my friends will get it passed in the next session. That's called the NICE bill, but it's a national informed consent exception. I think one of the greatest developments in healthcare was this doctrine of informed consent. Before anybody did anything to violate your body, they had, whether it's surgery, a jab, whatever, they had to first advise you of any risks inherent to the procedure, whatever they're proposing, and then how it applied to you with your biological makeup, your history, and then let you make a decision, give informed consent. Okay, I'm informed of everything, I understand the risks, go ahead and do it. That's informed consent. And it ought to be mandated, that ought to be a mandate for getting a vaccination, just like any other procedure. And I was deeply troubled this week by a couple of the most liberal justices saying, as intelligent as they are, they couldn't see any difference between putting on an external mask and being jabbed and having something injected into the core of your body. And they couldn't see a difference in that, because once you invade the body proper, then okay, so we're going to start putting a microchip in everybody. That used to be so far-fetched, we couldn't even see something that outrageous being mandated. And now, with this mRNA, the creator of the mRNA, Dr. Malone, I interviewed him when I was hosting Sean Hannity's radio show. He said, we don't have the testing to know exactly what the effect is. We need 5 years of testing to do that. And yet we got people saying we need to mandate this, and like Australia, we ought to put people in internment camps if they don't go along with it. No, this is America. It used to be the land of the free. Let people make their own decisions after they have the adequate information. I do think that is a totally improper mandate. And think about it. If the vaccines really work, then the only people that should be concerned would be the unvaccinated. And yet you have Biden coming out, and you listen to what he said. The effect is, we got to protect the vaccinated people from the unvaccinated by forcing the unvaccinated to get the vaccination that will not protect you against the unvaccinated. That doesn't make sense. If the vaccine works, then you shouldn't be worried about anything. You're protected. The only reason you wouldn't be protected is if it doesn't work. and it makes you subject to being sick. And when we see numbers like 81% of those who died in the UK in the last 3 months were fully vaccinated, there's issues. And just like I've got a couple of constituents, they're convinced that their spouses died because they got the injection, and in their case, they were people that were affected by the vaccine by just being filled with blood clots. Well, they should have had the right to have informed consent, knowing that they were particularly at risk before it was mandated. But there's just so much we don't know. Every American ought to have the right to make the decision. And if the Biden administration will not be willing to protect Americans by requiring testing or vaccines of those coming in illegally with who knows what kind of disease, then why should Americans be treated less fairly than those folks?
Couple more questions. As you know, Politico reported last week that your comments before January 6th of last year to Newsmax got on the Capitol Police's radar. The Political report said letting the will of the voters stand would mean, quote, the end of our republic, the end of the experiment in self-government, and that it said you seem to encourage violence as a means to the end. Gohmert said on the air the ruling would be that you got to go to the streets and be as violent as Antifa and Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
And I appreciate the question, because that has been misconstrued. It has been taken out of context with other things that I said and continue to say, and I've continued to say, and in fact, when I was on Hannity over 2 years ago on the radio show, I made very clear that the most effective way for us to accomplish goals is peaceful protests. And I have maintained that and continue to maintain that. But I've also been a student of history, been a fanatic in learning history since high school. Majored in history. I knew I owed the Army 4 years, so I majored in what I love, history. Historically speaking, as I was, when the institutions like the courts that we created to resolve disputes amicably, civilly, as a great bastion of civility, if they say, as the Supreme Court did on elections, yeah, okay, we're the only court that really has jurisdiction to handle this, but we don't want to touch it, it's too politically hot, that was the effect of their actions. But the further effect, when the institutions we create to resolve disputes refuse to do that job and resolve them civilly, then the message is, we courts would rather you resolve it in the streets. I'm totally against that. I have never, ever advocated for violence, but I also advocate for the courts to resolve disputes so that it doesn't degenerate into fighting in the streets. So I've never advocated that, and clearly for that to end up in a Capitol Police report is an indication that we've got some people heading up the Capitol Police that shouldn't be there, because most of the Capitol Police are my friends, and I talk to them just every day when I'm in Washington, and they know me, and they know I would never advocate violence, and I have never advocated violence. What I was advocating for is the courts to do their job, and that's clearly what I showed. Rather than advocating going to the streets, I went to court, trying to get the vice president to do what I felt was appropriate, and had a great compromise that we offered, and that was, look, it says we do this on January 6th, but clearly the constitutional authority to count votes, as every county clerk in Texas knows, includes the power to determine what are appropriate and legal votes. Just as the Constitution says the Senate has the right to advise and consent, that includes the right to dissent if you don't agree with somebody the president nominates. And so I wanted to establish that in court. The courts refused to take it up. I'm an advocate of going to court. I was doing what Democrats did in the last 3 elections of Republicans and going to the House floor and objecting. I believe in using the civil process, and that's exactly what I did, and that's what I advocate for, and I will continue to advocate that the courts need to do their jobs so that it doesn't send the message like they've been sending. We're scared to do our jobs, so that means go to the streets. I don't want things going to the street. I want people going to court, going to the legislature, and the institutions that were created to resolve disputes, resolve them.
I did have one other question, and
Sure.
I appreciate your time, and that is the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the Attorney General does not have the authority to initiate an investigation such as an election fraud unless they are invited, unless the AG's office is invited. This was a separation of powers issue.
Right.
Where are you on this?
Well, when I read that, it made very clear, and I'm sure you're aware, the Court of Criminal Appeals are probably the least known individuals in our state government that are elected. People vote for a name. We've seen it over and over again. People that don't know these candidates will vote for somebody because a name sounds better than another name. That's how Steve Mansfield got him elected. His name sounded better than his opponent, and he was a terrible justice and ended up being thrown out. But that made very clear we have got to elect judges, justices to the Court of Criminal Appeals that know what the heck they're talking about. Clearly, when you had an 8-1 decision like that, the 1 making so much constitutional sense, and the 8 saying basically the Attorney General could not prosecute because he's part of the executive branch, and the prosecutors are part of the judicial branch, tells me we've got to do more for our education in Texas, because if they don't understand the role of the Attorney General as the highest law enforcement officer in the state, we got to elect new justices on the Court of Criminal Appeals. And if you noticed, they came out with that decision just days after the filing deadline. So we had one candidate, Clint filed before against one of the justices, and I'm sure hoping he wins. But if they had come out with that decision before the filing deadline, then you would have seen all 3 of the justices up for re-election having opponents. So we got to start paying more attention to who gets elected to the Court of Criminal Appeals. They were just totally wrong on that. I've already been talking to legislators about how we go about fixing that. Some say, well, the Court of Criminal Appeals says it's a matter of Texas Constitution. I don't think it is. I think it would be fixed legislatively, but even if it requires an amendment to the Texas Constitution, just so that people as ignorant as some of those on the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals apparently are, so they can even understand, then let's do the amendment, get it on the next ballot, and get some legislation fixed so that we can enforce our laws. But they have no business on the Court of Criminal Appeals if they don't know the difference between executive and judiciary branch.
East Texas Congressman Louie Gohmert, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, and thanks
Appreciate
for
it.
those very intuitive questions. I appreciate it.